Hey everyone, welcome to another week of Secret Stash, and this week's coffee is the San Jose Yellow Pacamara from Apollon's Gold all the way from Tokyo, Japan, and this is a coffee produced by Erwin Mirsch Wingo, and this is a naturally processed Pacamara with flavor notes of mangosteen, passion fruit, and muscat. So this is a really interesting coffee, and I want to talk a bit about what it tastes like in this roasting style, but more so in today's video, I think what will be helpful is, well, dialing in coffees, because this is a roasting style which I think a lot of us would classify as light, ultra light, very, very light. And this is a coffee that, in order for you to really experience a lot of those flavor notes, requires a very, very long resting time. Definitely upwards of, I would say, 45, even 50, 60, 75 days before some of these coffees really open up. But what we can do today, and this is obviously a fresher roast of this coffee because I am making the recipes, and we're gonna talk a bit about that, is I want to just showcase kind of two very contrasting styles of recipes. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna dial in this coffee, and I'm going to provide the recipe that I like, or I think is the one that is going to be stronger. That's gonna go on the card for you guys. And I will also have a separate recipe that will be in the email as well as in the link in this YouTube video. So let's talk a little bit about this coffee. First of all, if you have never seen a Pacamara, they are massive. When you open these up and you take a look, you'll be like, whoa, these are huge, huge beans. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you've never seen a Pacamara. It's like, whoa, big beans. Second of all is this roasting style. This is a very, very lightly roasted coffee. If you get this in when we release this coffee, I am actually not entirely sure if there's going to be too many crazy aromatics that come off of the coffee, because this is a natural, but it's in this category of, I would classify as clean natural. So if you enjoyed the last release which we did, which was the Wave Natural from Pepe Hihon, this is going to kind of be in that same direction of like, okay, this is, yes, it's a natural, but it's going to be interesting, it's going to be clean, and this roasting style is going to be a very expressive and probably leaning much more floral than what you're used to if you've been tasting lighter roast coffees from other roasters. So this is an interesting thing to explore, and that's what we're going to do today. What you'll kind of find with these very, very lightly roasted coffees is that you can stretch the coffees in so many different directions. So on this coffee, we have predominant flavor notes of muscat, passion fruit, mangosteen. The easy way to think about this is probably going to be a very yellow fruit tasting coffee that is going to be sweet and hopefully clean. We'll find out as we brew this, but the nice thing about coffees like this is that you have so much range in terms of how you can express the coffee. When the coffee is roasted this lightly, for example, what we can probably do is we can push the coffee to have, say, more passion fruit, or maybe we can have it more sweetness, or, all these different types of things is what makes coffee brewing very fun, especially with xBloom, where we can basically take one recipe, make an adjustment, and taste it and be like, oh, whoa, what does this taste like versus this? And a lot of the more recent videos that we've posted have been about, I would say, dynamic manipulation. So a dynamic manipulation would be something like flow rate or RPM, most recently RPM, right? Like if you taste the same coffee at 60 RPM versus 120 RPM, it is going to most likely taste a little bit different. And I think that's what's quite fun. Now, the thing is depending on what type of coffee you're into, that is another tool that you can choose to use to present the coffee in a way that might be closer to your preferences. So this is something that I can spend talking about for hours and hours and hours, but let's go ahead and get brewing. I did this on a video a few months back on Prodigal Coffee's Esperanza Tabby 2, which was, let's just start with a really strong default recipe. So on the current version of our app, we have a lot of very strong recipes to play with. You'll have trending recipes and all of that. And the recipe that I like to start with, this 1 to 17 Brian recipe. It's cool, right? So what this recipe is it's actually grinding very fine at 54, 120 RPM, maximum temperature at the beginning with agitation. And this, to me, I think is how a lot of people who want to kind of be more impressed with some of these cleaner, light roast, more, I would say, tea-like coffees, this is a really great starting point to use, because what this recipe generally does is it does boost up some of the acidity, but extracts enough out. Now the question here is this grind size correct? And that's just the whole point of dialing in. With these ultra lightly roasted coffees, what you'll find is that, and of course depending on processing, you'll find that you can grind really, really fine. It is like you can get away with grind sizes that just do not seem correct. Like we've seen grind sizes all the way down to like the 40s on some of these ultra lights with Studio. And the thing is too, as the coffee starts to age, this is where you can really, really manipulate the grind sizes. Once those flavor notes start to really, really pop, you can play around with the grind sizes. Now, I do want to be upfront and say, like, this specific coffee, because we get these coffees in a lot earlier to make the recipes for you all, or this is what I do, it is on the fresher side. So I should be able to experience something very close to what you experience, but I bet you with any of the recipes we come up with in the coming 4 to even 8 weeks off of roast of when this coffee arrives to your house, it is gonna taste absolutely amazing. So let's go ahead and begin brewing. Beans are really big on this one, but we have featured Apollon's Gold many, many times on Secret Stash as well as on our regular coffee marketplace. Always just really interesting coffees. But let's go ahead and grind and begin tasting. I was grinding for espresso here. I was going to smell it, but I was grinding for espresso and the numbers were really small. So here we go. It smells very fresh. I mean, I think this specific roast is about a week off, but it smells quite yellow. I do get a bit of that, the natural component in here. You get kind of that like fruitiness from a natural, but it smells directionally or color-wise yellow. The flow rate for this coffee is also just turned all the way up, 3.5. And I do this, generally speaking, a longer bloom with all of these lighter roasted coffees. So you're going to see it's going to be about a 50 to 60 second bloom. Really try to let the coffee open up. This is on the fresher end, even for a lighter roasted coffee. That smells really nice. There is an interesting level of sweetness that I am smelling. I would say like fruitiness, yellow, again, still yellow. Yeah, I let this coffee really kind of open up. Like you'll see we're about over a minute before we even start adding more and more water here. Yeah, and even grind size 54, which I think is a pretty fair grind size to start with for some of these lighter roasted coffees. You'll see that the flow is very constant, which to me is indicating I can grind this coffee potentially even finer if that is what I am going after. So, but first of all, we'll taste it. Oftentimes these dialed in default recipes are quite strong for most coffees, especially if you're chasing a certain roasting style. And you'll kind of find that a lot of the coffees we do feature on Secret Stash can benefit from getting pushed. They also can just be expressed in so many different ways. But this might be, already really strong, and we might want to play with something like, say, a coarser grind with a lot of pores versus a finer grind with less pores. So there are just so many different ways to express coffees. Most of the time when I look at dialing in these types of coffees and playing around with lighter roast coffees, I look to present coffees in drastically different ways. And the easiest way to adjust that presentation is grind size. That's really going to be a lot of that intensity of flavor notes. Some people really like more tea-like presentation. Some people like acidity forward stuff. Personally, I like a lot of acidity forwardness, but also there are then more nuanced tools like RPM that we talked about in a previous video, where we can have fine grind, but then there's another layer, which is let's tune it a little with the high RPM versus the low RPM, and then we're in the weeds, deep in the weeds, talking about how can coffee taste. But coffee is very subjective. This is just how it is. There we go. We'll wrap up. I have that agitation at the end. Honestly, visually looking at this, I'm like, this and smelling it, like, this is probably going to be very, very strong just right off the start, which is pretty exciting for me because that means I don't need to make so many recipes and dial in a lot of stuff. But we will for sure make one other recipe for this. I also want to mention this is for anyone who's newer to xBloom. Like, look, recipe dialing in, you can do this forever. We can make these coffees taste in so many different ways, and there are just times where you're going to be like, this is good enough. And depending on what standards you're using, for me, I'm like, when I taste some of these coffees, I'm like, wow, this is incredible. If this is incredible for me, it's probably going to be really, really good, more than incredible for a lot of people. And this really depends on what standards people have for coffee. But generally speaking, we give you enough of the tools. And really, it starts with the coffee. We give you great coffee so you can push the coffee in any sort of direction for whatever you'd like. So we finish up here. Wow, there is florality in this. It's clean smelling. Let's give it a taste. This might actually be really good off the start. Please feel free to use this recipe I'm using. Sometimes you'll find out, if you've been on Secret Stash enough, you'll be like, how come all the recipes look kind of similar? And it's just because that's just how I enjoy coffee. But also, it's like these recipes just work. They're good. The machine is actually quite forgiving. Studio, original, because of the setup we use, very, very forgiving in terms of just making, I would say, a pretty good cup of coffee. Floral. Okay, now I smell yellow. Some of those that yellow fruit. I do smell a bit of that natural at the back, but it does not smell funky at all. Okay, very, very sweet. I will say what I am tasting is quite fresh. This coffee I am tasting like, okay, this coffee needs to really, really rest. So if you've ever tasted coffee and it looks like it's been brewed well, it tastes like you can taste some of that acidity, you can taste some of that sweetness, you can taste all of that, but then you kind of taste into a wall. That is what I would say roast kind of, or very fresh roast tastes like. Like this needs to open up. I'm not tasting like, okay, this is a bad roast or this is, a badly brewed coffee. What I'm tasting is like the acidity is there, but then it kind of runs into like a wall. The sweetness is there, runs into a wall, and that to me is an indicator of this is good. It's a little fresh. But a lot of that will be mitigated as you let the coffees cool. So it is okay to brew some of these coffees when they are much fresher. You do want to, of course, let them kind of off gas a bit, and that's what that initial longer bloom is meant to do. So now that's cooled, this is where we're getting a bit past that, the freshness of the coffee. We're getting a little bit past that. So, there we go. Okay, so this is, I would say, a very a bit of a heavier acidity versus this coffee from last week, which was, I would say, like yellow florals, tropical. This is similar to this, but heavier, like much of a sugarier body. I think this is definitely because of the Pacamara varietal. I would also say that this is natural forward. Scary, but it's clean natural forward. So it's a lot of that fruitiness, a lot of that sugariness. There is this heavier body, even at this 1:17 ratio that is like up front. So we have this coffee here. I'm going to let this cool, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick another recipe. Maybe what we'll do is we'll actually pick a recipe made by Apollon's Gold. Let's actually compare my recipe to Apollon's Gold's recipe. So Apollon's Gold, in Tokyo, they have a machine. They've made a bunch of recipes for us on some of our last whole bean releases. Let's play around with their recipe with this coffee. But, oh yeah, this is a great coffee. While this other one's brewing, let's for sure talk a bit about this roasting style, because I think this roasting style is very worthwhile mentioning. So here's the thing, with a lot of these coffees, the recipes are actually made for a roasting style. So this is a recipe that Apollon's Gold has that works for all of their recipes. So for those of you who picked up the Pepe Hihan Gesha Wave, that's this recipe. This is a recipe that actually is quite strong on a lot of these other coffees from them. So I'll talk a bit about this roasting style because I think that is what is fun. It is actually very similar grind. So 55. I started with 54. This is 55, but the pouring patterns and the recipe is actually quite different. So we'll let this brew. I think this is going to be a faster brew already just looking at it. So my brew was about almost 4 minutes of total brew time with much longer pauses in between. This is a much quicker brew. So my guess is that this is going to be more acidity forward than my brew. It's at 1 tick finer than the grind size I'm using. it probably is going to taste slightly different just simply because of the total brew time. That's another indicator you can use. And usually that's controlled by grind size. But of course, you can adjust your pouring patterns, your pouring times, your flow rates, and all that will obviously impact your end cup. One other thing to add is like, look, I am spending a lot of time talking about recipes. I'm spending a lot of time talking about like, what is it going to do doing this versus this? You have to work with good coffee to experience those differences, right? We are using a very strong coffee, which has a great roasting style. We'll talk a bit about that roasting style. And that is what is allowing us to experience these differences in the cup, is that the coffee is, good enough that we can push it in so many different directions. You can do the different pouring patterns, you can do the different temperatures, you can do, all of that, and you can experience a very different presentation of the coffee. Oftentimes, with these ultra lightly roasted coffees, you will find a really interesting level of florality in them. Because the coffees are so light at times though, if you don't brew them correctly, if you don't push them hard enough, aka use hotter temperatures, some of those faster flow rates, some of that finer grind, a lot of these coffees are gonna taste not really like anything. They're gonna taste, oftentimes I get something like maybe watery. You'll get stuff like, very floral, but not really defined acidity. And that's really where pushing these coffees hard is beneficial. But that is what you're kind of working with, is you're working with this lighter roasting style where it's like, it is forgiving in the sense that you can do so much to it and it will taste great. But if you do not brew it in a correct way, or really I'd say a correct approach, and you don't rest the coffee long enough, it's not really going to taste like anything. But it's a very different style of presentation to say, I would say a more North American roasting style, light North American expressive roasting style. Whereas I feel that these are generally more floral and delicate. You can make these coffees taste louder, but I would say that because they're so lightly roasted, you're really a lot of times tasting the style of the roast, which is this lighter, floral, more delicate approach with a lot of that expressive acidity underneath. And of course you can manipulate some of that and try to push the acidity up, but you're working with a coffee, and more so, the roasting style, that is trying to present coffee in this way, which is like, this is just a different thought process, a different way of expressing coffees, and I think it is so super fun. So anyway, we have 2 recipes now. This coffee's really started to open up. So if you do have even this lighter, really lightly roasting style, which again, rests the coffee for like 6 to 8 weeks, right? We're talking like, don't even try brewing these coffees. So there are times where on Secret Stash we've ordered these coffees and we just let them sit there for weeks on weeks for them to be rested for you to taste. I will say that even if once you brew them, you let it sit here, it is going to taste pretty okay. So that's what I'm experiencing here. Is like this one we brewed about 15 minutes ago. It's getting almost to room temperature, but the acidity is really starting to open up, and I'm getting a lot of this passion fruit and mangosteen. I would say that, but it's very forward. It's like super forward, and then the rest of the cup is very delicate, very clean, for natural, very, it's like just lingering on my palate. I'm quite curious how this coffee is going to perform in the coming weeks when you guys get it. But I will say right now, it's tasting great. So let's taste this recipe now. This is Apollon's Gold recipe. This is their recipe. Will my recipe be better? We'll find out. Or their recipe might be the one that I like more, and we'll go with this recipe. So the biggest difference between this recipe and my recipe is the time between each of the pours. I let each of the pours really, really go out, whereas this recipe is just adding water constantly, trying to maximize that flow there. So it's a different, it's a minute difference, which in coffee world will have a big impact on the cup. But when you have great coffee like this, it's fun, right? This is super fun to be able to have 2 drastically different recipes and still have a good cup. Hopefully a good cup. Let's taste it. This is very different than my recipe. First of all, much more delicate body. Acidity is under there. It's sweet, it's clean, it's floral. There's a tropical acidity there, but very well tied together. Quite different than this, where my recipe, even though with this roasting style, is not ultra loud in terms of acidity, at least at this point in time because the coffee's so fresh, much heavier body, much heavier natural components, like that natural sugariness, that natural heaviness of like fruit, if you've ever tasted natural processed coffees. That is much louder and in your face, and that's most likely because of this 1 extra minute of brew time. Whereas this is very clean, very delicate, and very sweet. You know, once the coffee cools down, that's where we're getting a lot of that, this passion fruit acidity, yellow tasting. Linger on my tongue is there. I think this is very different than this, more specifically in what's lingering on my palate. This longer brew time, that acidity is just what is on my palate, and then it becomes that sweet, clean, and floral. Whereas this is more of the sweetness of the coffee. And this is the thing with recipe dialing. Oh, wow. Okay, I get that muscat flavor note in this much more than this. I was getting a lot more passion fruit. This here, I'm getting a bit of that like grape acidity. This, more passion fruit acidity. Very different presentations. Now, here's the thing. This is why we give you both recipes, is which recipe honors the coffee more, right? In this case, I will say that this recipe that they have made that works on a lot of their coffees, I think is actually a bit stronger in terms of showing you guys what is in this coffee and what it should taste like. And that is kind of the thing with coffee. It's very subjective. However, I do think that this recipe here is much more interesting to drink. This is like, oh wow, look at what's in this roasting style. Look at what's in this coffee. Look at the acidity. Look at that intensity, right? Whereas this here, this style of brewing is very, dare I say, thought-provoking. You have to think about what there's a lot going on in this cup that you have to process. There's a lot of stuff happening here, but it's easier to pick apart, but we lose some of those more finer details, which is in this cup. And that's the kind of, you know, fun thing with coffee is like, we have the exact same coffee. And what we've done is we have just played with 2 very different recipes. And I would say, look, both of these recipes are great. This coffee's great, but they are drastically different in terms of what they taste like. And that is what's fun. Yeah, I mean, I'm tasting them again. I'm second guessing myself. Very different presentations. And this is kind of a thing where it's like when we work with a lot of these roasters and they make recipes for their coffee, their approach is most of the time probably better than, you know, your approach or my approach to some of these coffees, because they work with their roasting style a lot, right? When they're dealing with this type of roasting style that is this light, and they're using expressive coffees like this, you know, they know how to brew their coffee in a way that is aligned with, well, you know, what they're thinking about. Whereas this is my style of brewing, right? And, you know, a lot of you guys do enjoy my style of brewing. I do think that, you know, this recipe is a little stronger for presenting to you guys what is this coffee supposed to taste like. And what I think what most of you guys will do is you'll probably find a recipe that's kind of in between. I think for sure this is more interesting to drink, but this is more, you know, this is what the coffee is supposed to taste like. So that's why I wanted to talk a bit about today is, this is a cool roasting style. This is this week's Secret Stash coffee, which is this yellow Pacamara from Nicaragua, from Apollon's Gold and Wingo. It is a really interesting coffee, you know, clean, natural, Pacamara. Beans are huge, so much juice, so much yellow fruit in there. But this is the thing, was when you have a roasting style that is you know, this nice, you can present the coffee in so many different ways. But yeah, I think we'll go with this recipe on here. I might make a few adjustments on here to maybe optimize it a little more for the resting time when you guys get it in. But yeah, that's what I wanted to talk a bit about today, is Secret Stash release, roasting styles, and recipes. If you found this interesting, please let us know. But otherwise, thank you so much for spending the time to watch this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Maybe the way to do it is we do this. We combine the 2 recipes together. Honestly, this tastes really good. Yeah, well, you know, when you have really great brewed coffee, you can do stuff like that. There are no rules. It's a bit easier than dialing in everything on the app to make it taste in between. Just combine them together. So yeah, goodbye.